Okay, the room's starting to fill up, so I think we'll kick off. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest PRASEG event. My name's Dom Goggins. I'm the advisor to PRASEG, and I've emerged from my usual position behind the scenes on these meetings just to give a quick introduction. Being Mafalami, our chair, I've just had a call from him, and he's currently stuck, unable to join the call on the way to Batley and Spen to campaign in the by-election, but he will be with us as soon as he can. In the meantime, I hope you don't mind me introducing this conversation. We're focusing today on pumped storage and its role in delivering a stable, low-carbon electricity supply for the nation. Why are we looking at this? Well, we're inevitably moving towards a grid that will have to deal with intermittent supply, and we need ways of storing energy so that we can release it quickly when we need it. All the talk is about battery storage, but pump storage is a long-established way of doing that, and we're gonna focus today on Cruachan 2, which is a site that Drax run in Scotland. There were developments last week in relation to that site, which I'm delighted to say that David Ball, who's the development director for Drax and who's in charge of the site at Cruachan 2, will be able to tell us all about. We're also joined by Dr Doug Parr, who's the Chief Scientist and Policy Director at Greenpeace, and is also the nicest and the smartest person that I've met working in this sector. Doug, it's a pleasure to have you here. And we've got Alan Brown, who's a Vice Chair of PRASEG, and he is the Energy and Climate Change Spokesperson for the SNP in Westminster. There's going to be opening remarks from all three panellists. And then we're going to have a Q&A. The Q&A is open, the chat is open. I encourage you all to use it and, you know, to have a discussion on there, because these meetings are always better when there is lively participation from the audience. We're delighted to have worked with Drax to put this event together. Drax are big supporters of PRASEG, and we appreciate their support. David, I'll hand over to you now. Just thank everybody for joining and look forward to a good discussion. Thanks very much.
Okay, hopefully I can share my screen. Okay, can you see that? Okay, so just to talk you through what we're looking at with Cruachan 2, our project in Scotland. The IPCC has recognised that there is a need for long duration storage in order to support the deployment of renewables across the sector. Renewables, as everybody knows, are mostly intermittent and uncontrollable, and there is a need to store the power that comes from them in order to fill the gaps when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. The other factor that we need to bear in mind is that a lot of the renewables in the UK are based in the north of Scotland, where the wind's highest, or offshore, mostly off the Scottish and the North Sea coasts. And that creates some issues in terms of moving the power from north to south. So there's times when there's too much energy in Scotland, which means that power can't move. So as you've probably seen in some of the press, there are times when the energy is constrained off and there are payments having to be made to generators for not generating. And what we aim to do is store some of that power so it can be used efficiently later on. So our project in Scotland, Cruachan, is currently 440 megawatts of pump storage. It actually provides a number of services to the system. So it provides a lot of stability services that keep the system running, as well as storing power. Now, Cruachan is about 35% of the UK's current storage capacity. There are 4 big pump storage assets, 2 in North Wales and 1 up in the north of Scotland, and the other one in North Mid Scotland, which houses Cruachan. So what Cruachan does on this slide here is it takes power when prices are low or there's excess power on the system. It uses that to pump water up the hill through the Ben Cruachan mountain into an upper reservoir. And then when it wants to release power into the market, that energy is released down the mountain again, down into the bottom and lower reservoir, which in our case is Loch Ore. This project has been in existence since 1967. It employs about 30 staff on site, and we look at around a load factor of about between 5 and 10% on this asset through the year. We can run for about 16 hours, providing about 440 megawatts of power. So what we did with Cruachan 2 was we looked at where the best use of our water reservoir is at the top of the mountain. So as I said earlier, we can store about 16 hours of generation up at the top of the mountain. And what we've seen is that the market needs a variety of storage devices, right the way through from instantaneous storage that comes from batteries, which provides storage for between half an hour and 2 hours economically, right through pump storage, which is typically good for 8 to 12 hours. And then the market is looking at where to find even longer duration storage. So what we identified was that economically and for the system, we've probably got a little bit too much storage at the top. So what we're looking to do is potentially increase the generation output of the station. So increase the peak amount it can generate, but not increase the amount of water we hold at the top. So we won't be increasing the reservoir or putting in place a new dam. What we've identified is by doing this, we can actually save the consumer in England and Wales and Scotland somewhere in excess of 360 million through life, in excess of the revenue that we would earn from the project. And this all comes from things that we as the owner wouldn't see. So things like constrained off payments that are not being paid to wind generators can't generate when the system is providing too much in the north. Avoiding reinforcement of the network in the area, and providing further ancillary services to support the system, which are currently paid for. We think it provides a long-term solution to a problem. Our current asset is about 50 years old. We don't see any reason why the new build would not be another 50 years on top of that. Compared with batteries, which are, as we've said here, somewhere between 10 and 15 years life. But there is a downside to this. These have a very long construction period. They are somewhere in the region of 6 to 7 years to construct, and they are highly capital intensive. It's probably no secret that we're probably talking about somewhere around £500 million in investment for this project. It would generate a lot of jobs and local benefits in the area. But we are trying to seek some sort of stability mechanism to assist us with this, which isn't there in the market at the moment. So just to go on to what we are actually looking at here for the project. So this graphic that we've got shows the current Cruachan reservoir on the left-hand side, which holds the water at the top of the hill. And then the Loch Ore on the right-hand side, which is where the water comes from and returns to. On this diagram, on the bottom of it, the bottom half of the white lines are the existing Cruachan power station. We call that Cruachan 1. And then the lines on the top are the tunnels and access ways that we're looking to build for Cruachan 2. So it involves tunneling out probably rock in excess of about 3/4 of the size of Wembley Stadium in terms of volume of rock we have to take out and take away from the area. And our team is looking at the best ways of doing that at the moment as part of their planning process that they've just launched last week with the local authorities. And just to finish off with our timelines in terms of when we're seeing things happening on this project. As I said last week, we launched our planning process. In Scotland, it's a Section 36 activity under the Electricity Act rather than a development consent, which it would be in England and Wales. That launches this week, so there's quite a lot of material being produced for local stakeholders. We are due to see the publication from BEIS and Ofgem of the Smart System and Flexibility Plan this week, which is looking at ways in which the system will need to be adapted in the future to cope with the move from fossil fuels to renewables. We are engaging with the market in terms of how to best provide a route to market for these projects. As I said, they're long-term investments with high capital requirements. So we're going to need some sort of stability mechanism to assist us with that. We're then aiming for a final investment decision somewhere around 2024, which leads us into operation somewhere around 2030. So as I mentioned there, we have a need for a stability mechanism for this project. The volatility of earnings from pump storage is quite high. So some years they don't earn very much, depending on what the market is doing. Some years they earn a lot. So what we are talking with a number of stakeholders about is to see if there is a mechanism we could put in place to provide us some sort of stability on that, which will allow us to bring in some more debt and to underwrite the big capital investment as a private company. You'll be seeing some publications from us on that issue in the next coming months, and we're hoping that the smart systems flexibility will also address some of those issues. Thank you. That's the summary of Cruachan 2. I think I'll then pass it back for any comments at all.
Thanks very much, David. I think, I mean, that was a massively useful overview. I think at this stage, let's move to Doug, get Doug's perspective on the site and on the issues at stake, and then I think we'll move to Alan and then into comments. But yeah, thanks very much. Over to you, Doug.
Great. Thanks, Dom. Thanks, David. Yeah, some of the stuff has actually been covered by David, but just let me reiterate the top points about why Greenpeace is supporting new pump storage. First and foremost, we are in a transition to a net zero energy system, of which the electricity system is going to be absolutely central and will be increasingly providing the energy for heating and transport. So we're going to be very reliant on it. If we take what the International Energy Agency suggests, then we're talking about that conversion taking place to completely net zero or zero emission power system in the next 14 years. Now, that means that the vast bulk of what we need to do is going to happen with technologies that we already know exist. And on any kind of cost-effective pathway, that means the vast bulk of what we generate is going to come from variable renewables, particularly wind and solar. Now, under those circumstances, as any piece of analysis indicates, and there have been a couple coming out in the last 2 weeks, one from Imperial College and one from Energy Systems Catapult, high variable renewables systems, which are an inevitable consequence of the legal obligations that we have put upon ourselves and need to put upon ourselves, means that we will need a lot of storage, and we will need a lot of storage that we more or less know how to build. Now, I am a big supporter of things like liquid air storage and the interesting new technologies like effectively high density pump storage using lower hills than is going to be necessary using conventional pump storage. But these are interesting new technologies. They might be able to contribute. I hope they will. But actually, a lot of what we need to do is going to have to be done with what we've got already. So that transition is happening at speed. And as we can see from David's presentation, where the timeline for operation is 2030, a lot of the things that we're going to need for that kind of 2035 deadline, or around there anyway, certainly in the 2030s, we need to get cracking on pretty rapidly in order to be able to make that transition effectively. Because it's not just about the generation, as David outlined, it's also about the supporting system on the grid that allow those variable renewables to be used when we need them. And that includes, yes, it includes frequency control, it includes stabilization, but it also includes long duration storage. And it seems to me that if we've got something that we know works, that we know we're going to need a considerable amount of storage, then for those that have got quite long timelines of delivery, then we should be cracking on and finding ways of making it happen. Now, I don't have a particular policy of support mechanism that would need to be put in place, and I'll be interested in what the further reports that come out later in the year that David talked about, and see what would work for those people and organisations who want to develop pump storage. But I think the political message I would like to give is that, provided there is local community support, and provided that the environmental impacts locally are not so detrimental as to make projects unviable or unacceptable rather, then we as a nation should be getting behind pumped storage wherever we think it can suitably be developed, because we're going to need it. And long duration storage alongside interconnection, demand response and so on, and the shorter term storage that is increasingly provided by batteries, are going to be necessary components of making that rapid transition to eliminate the carbon emissions that we need to get rid of. So that's my piece, and pass back to you, Dom.
Doug, thanks very much. You talk about community support. Actually, I note that Jinni Minto, who's the member of the Scottish Parliament that covers the area where the site is actually on the call. So I wonder if Jinni would like to make a comment on community support. I saw that Jinni had made some supportive comments last week when the plans to expand were announced. But first, I'd just like to pass over to Alan Brown, who's the SNP spokesperson for energy and climate change in Westminster. He's also a big supporter of PRASEG and a vice chair of PRASEG. So thanks, Alan, for joining us and for your support for our work over the long term. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. It's a pleasure to speak here and a pleasure to follow Doug and David. I'll try and be brief. As almost an aside, so I'm a civil engineer and I've been lucky enough to visit Cruachan and get a tour under the mountains. So it's really impressive when you see the engineering feat, the tunnels, and obviously all the mechanical and electrical stuff. So anybody here that's not visited, I thoroughly recommend doing that once COVID restrictions lifted. It's certainly well worth it. In terms of energy policy, I've nailed my colours firmly to the mast, and we're very supportive of pumped storage hydro. It's a matter I've raised in Parliament several times. I actually met the Energy Minister this other week just to discuss pumped storage hydro and emphasise the need for the UK government to agree a mechanism for a route to market to allow the likes of Cruachan to progress. Now, if you look at projections for 2050, what an energy system might look like, I've seen estimates that might need 25 to 40 gigawatts of storage. Now, actually already in terms of pumped hydro storage, there's nearly 5 gigawatts of storage in the pipeline. So it seems to me, if you look at the lower estimate of 25 gigawatts, pumped storage hydro could provide 20% of the storage we require. It's a proven technology, and if we look at Cruachan 2, then obviously what you're doing is actually making best use of an existing asset. So why wouldn't you progress with it? it just makes sense to get the best out of an asset that's already there. Now, if you look at benefits of pumped storage hydro in general, it actually helps for black start. You know, if we have any blackouts, pumped storage hydro can help kickstart systems. As David and Doug's touched on, helps in grid balancing, which actually reduces some upgrade costs in the whole transmission system. But importantly, it allows a greater deployment of onshore and offshore wind into the system, because it stops us having to curtail wind generation by turning it off. So it allows a greater deployment, and that's also very important, because for me it takes away the possible reliance on nuclear energy. The UK government at the moment is still wedded to nuclear energy. We know Hinkley's progressing, which is the cost of that at £92.50 per megawatt strike hour is just ridiculous, and that's a 35-year contract compared to £40 strike rate for offshore wind, which is just a 15-year contract. And actually, you know, the UK government still argues that they need nuclear power for base load. But if you look at it at the moment, there's eight nuclear stations at the moment. Half of them were meant to go offline by 2024, but in actual fact, they just announced the other week that Dungeness, which was supposed to go offline in 2028, is now already been decommissioned 7 years early. In actual fact, out the existing stations, only sizable B is still going to be operating by 2030. So that in itself shows we don't need nuclear energy in the mix if we can operate without these existing stations. So why throw money at new nuclear? And I certainly hope the UK government would revisit that. Doug mentioned the report from Imperial College. So that report analysis suggests that doing the 4.5 to 5 gigawatt of pumped storage hydro is actually going to save £690 million a year in systems costs by 2050 in terms of operational costs. So again, actually making that investment is going to save money for us, the consumers, in the long term. So it really is value for money. And also Doug mentioned the Good Energy Capital Systems report, which that actually predicts that we could have a electricity generation system which is 98% based on renewable energy generation. Another 2% is actually would be supplied by Hinkley, and they've only allowed for that because obviously there's that government commitment to Hinkley. So it seems to me pumped storage hydro really would play a massive part on a coherent net zero plan. We should also be investing in marine, tidal, and setting targets for onshore, offshore wind, floating wind. And actually one other thing that we need to look at in the mix is the grid charging system, because that at the moment is actually possibly going to prevent investment in renewables in Scotland. So there's a lot to be looked at and around. There's no doubt that pumped storage hydro really would be integral to that. And certainly, you know, just to repeat, I firmly support it, and I really hope that Cruachan 2 gets a go-ahead in the near future.
Thanks very much, Alan. There are some questions coming in on the Q&A, and I've got a couple, but I'm just going to try and bring in Jinni, who's the member of the Scottish Parliament representing the local area. And we've had a comment from the office of Brendan O'Hara as well, who's the Westminster representative for the area, who's also supportive of the development and the plan to expand. David, it seems like there's unanimous support for the project at the moment, which I'm sure will be music to the ears of everybody at Drax. Just going to give a second to allow Jinni to talk, and hopefully this will work. Over to you, Jinni, if you can.
Okay, well, hopefully you can hear me. I don't know if you can see me or not. I'd just like to reflect on what Alan said about visiting Cruachan. I visited Cruachan about 40 years ago and was very young at the time and can remember it very clearly. So just the whole experience of understanding how that power capture was working and that storage was working as well. And like Alan, I have very similar views on nuclear. My husband was involved in a documentary 10 years after the Chernobyl disaster, and that absolutely confirmed in my mind what he saw, that nuclear was certainly not the right way to go. I am very supportive of the Cruachan 2 development. From a community's perspective, I've had a couple of emails in support, but also a couple of emails of slight concern. So I think it's really important for, as we move forward through the planning process, that the community is consulted right through that process, so they understand the impact, both positive and perhaps some of the negative ones as well. So we need an absolute honesty with the community as to how it's going to impact. I mean, I absolutely recognise that Argyll and Bute could become the renewable powerhouse for Scotland. And I think we have to find ways of making sure that the community is taken along on that journey. So to that end, I was really pleased to hear what Doug Parr was saying about ensuring that the community is supportive and also that it's not detrimental to the environment. Because again, Argyll and Bute is very, very popular tourist destination. So key point is ensuring that the community is consulted throughout the process, and hopefully we can find ways of working together to ensure that they are completely connected with the development as it hopefully happens.
Jenny, thanks very much for those comments. And, you know, I think absolutely Doug's point about community support is well taken, and it's interesting to hear that they were both supportive and, you know, I guess questioning correspondence with your constituents so far. It'd be interesting to see how that develops. As I said, hopefully Bim's going to join us very soon. Jenny, your hand's just gone up.
Yeah, can I just come in on that? I think it's a cumulative effect, because Argyll and Bute, as I said, you know, is a renewable energy powerhouse, and it's just the concerns about how the, you know, if because we've got pylons and even higher pylons coming in, and similar with wind turbines, higher ones and higher ones, that's where the concern is. So it's a cumulative effect of the renewable power industry on the mainland, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, David. I wonder if have you got a comment on that or a quick response to that before we jump into the other questions?
Yeah, it's one of the things that we're very conscious of is the potential impact on the local area. Obviously, once it's built, it's all underground, so there's very little impact once it's in place. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of rock to come out of the mountain to build it, which needs to go somewhere. There'll be a lot of workers in the area, so that's one of the things that we're very keen to engage the local community on, in terms of how best to mitigate that and what the impacts are. Certainly one of the things that my team has been engaged with Scottish Highways about at the moment is what the effects are on the A85, which runs right past that, the site there, and making sure we don't have any negative impacts during the peak summer season, for example.
Thanks, David. I think we're going to jump into questions. As I said, hopefully Bim's going to be here in a minute and he can jump in and marshal the Q&A. There are a few questions in the Q&A and a couple of comments in the chat. I'm going to take them, but not in chronological order. I'm just going to start with Drew Barrett's question about what structure of government support Drax would like to see for the site. And I think, David, we will start that question with you, but I'm going to add another question to it, I think, well, for yourself, but also probably more for Doug and Alan, about what level of confidence you've got, particularly, you know, in light of the Committee on Climate Change update to Parliament last week, which kind of shone the spotlight on the gap between the kind of high-level political and legal commitments from government and the detailed policy and delivery that really needs to drive us towards net zero. What level of confidence you've got that government will actually bring forward the kind of support that we need, both for this site and for pumped storage more generally. So, David, if you can take that first, and then maybe just move through to Doug and Alan on that too.
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time thinking about this, and we've been engaging with some external advisors as well to give us some guidance on this. And we've been trying to think about what works for all type all durations of storage, right the way through from batteries through to the eventual very long duration storages which come into place. And the impact we're trying to mitigate is the volatility between years of earnings, because to be honest, we see that these are probably investable projects on the long term. What the problem is that from year to year, the revenues do flip around quite a lot, which makes them quite a difficult investment proposition for a private investor and for lenders to it. So where we conclude that's probably the most logical way to end up with this one is a cap and floor arrangement, similar to that used for the interconnectors, which limits the downside for the investor, usually covering their cost of debt, something like that. But in return, there's a cap so that the investor doesn't earn excessive returns, which is the quid pro quo. I'll be honest and say in our base case, we probably don't see us hitting the cap or the floor that we propose as being sensible areas, but it just gives the investor and any lenders to projects those comforts that they're not going to be left high and dry.
Thanks, David. Alan and Doug, any comment on both the mechanism but also the kind of the politics around it?
I suppose in terms of the mechanism, I mean, with myself, I've engaged with the different companies involved in pumped storage hydro. I've taken that cap and floor suggestion and put that to the Minister to consider. I think there seems to be an understanding now of the benefits of pumped storage hydro, so I'm hopeful, but if you look at the bigger picture, I'm less hopeful so that the government does have complementary policies that all come together. Now we're still waiting on the net zero plan, which is to come out before COP26. But you know, if you look at the whole decarbonisation agenda, you know, still waiting on the heat and building strategy, hydrogen strategy to come. So there's actually a lot of big thinking still to be done in energy policy, and I do think the government's moving too slowly, is my honest answer there. Actually, I'm quite frustrated, if truth be told.
Yeah, well, I'd very much reflect those comments. The thing about the transition that we need to make are two things: speed, scale. And it's one thing to tell a good story. It's another thing to actually get the levels of infrastructure delivery that need to be there to make it happen. And each of those seem to have a certain amount of complexity associated with them. Hence, you know, the 2030 timeline for Cruachan 2. It seems to me that there are, you know, if we had a lot of time to do this, then it wouldn't be such an issue. You could spend some time sorting things out, but actually we're not in that space now. We've got some good targets. We've got them in offshore wind, electric vehicles. There's even a very, you know, quite a decent target on homes that was set in 2017. And actually that's 4 years on now, and not an awful lot has happened to deliver it on home efficiency. So I think, you know, our analysis at Greenpeace has been actually, this is where, sometime before the CCC report came out, is that this is now where the battle is going to be. It's not about setting targets. It's going to be about how can we get the sometimes quite granular policies in place to make it happen, and sometimes the institutional changes that are needed. Because when I look at the sort of things that are going to be needed for the grid, is the Ofgem current mandate fit for purpose? Don't think so. Is Ofgem still the right kind of body that we need to manage the system? Don't think so. So yeah, there's quite a lot of change needs to happen to deliver the kind of speed and scale that is necessary, rather than working within the constraints that we currently find ourselves in.
Thanks, Doug. And I think while you're on this, I mean, you're kind of straying into the territory of a couple of the other questions here about the policy and regulatory barriers. I think to large scale storage specifically, but you know, I think you've got a broader view on this. I mean, what you know, what do you think that needs to be brought forward now as a matter of urgency? I think specifically on storage, but also I think more generally on the path to net zero. I mean, Alan mentioned a couple of the big strategies that we've been waiting for, sector by sector: heat and buildings, hydrogen, and obviously the overarching national net zero strategy, all of which has been promised, well, long ago, but like recently promised before COP. Just, I guess, a view on that, because that'll speak to a question from Evelyn, and that's backed up by an anonymous attendee as well.
Right. Well, let me give you some opening thoughts on that. So I think storage generally, not long duration storage, where, you know, it feels to me like the cap and collar arrangement that we use for interconnectors probably is the right mechanism. But I don't know, because I'm not playing in those electricity markets, and nor do I have the ability to see what the other potential revenues might be from other mechanisms. But anyway, that's the long duration one. Now with storage and DSR, it feels to me like they're in the place that actually we find that solar is in that place, which is that they can go at a certain speed. So there was a report out from Solar Energy UK, excuse me, I think last week, saying that they expect to get to about 20 something gigawatts just on the basis of market rates for power. So that's the level of deployment that they think they could get to just on that basis by 2030. Well, that sounds great, because it's kind of something like doubling, but actually we need it to be more than tripling. And so just allowing kind of the natural pace of development as the market allows, and let's also remember that electricity markets are not God-given tablets of stone, they are things that we create. The speed of development of that, and of battery storage, and of DSR is not going at the rate that it needs to. Now, how do you tackle that? Well, the solar solution, which I think would apply to storage as well, is that some of the tax incentives that or tax penalties that are getting in the way, then they need to be removed to see how fast we could actually boost that speed of development. So you know, there's VAT payable at 20% rate on some installations of solar. You know, we know that business rates for business development of solar can have quite penal charges on, at least in England, on the cost of those installations and what they do to your business rates. You know, these are things that, again, are kind of, this stuff is no longer fit for purpose if we want to go at the speed and scale that we need to deliver at. Storage, I think, has got a problem with VAT. It's got double charging on, because it's both the generator and the user. I think there are some other mechanisms that I'm not completely across that also act as that kind of brake on how fast you would want to see them deployed. So my guess is those could be tackled relatively quickly, as well as perhaps some, if we're going to keep the capacity market, then maybe we need to see some adjustments to the capacity market to have a more facilitative environment for particularly DSR, which hasn't been well treated in the past. I mean, there have been court cases saying they've not been well treated, but that hasn't actually amended the capacity market very much in terms of the detailed rules.
Thanks, Doug. And David, I just wonder if we can come to you on the same question. I mean, you've talked about the mechanism that you feel is required, but if you can give a broader view on the regulatory barriers and challenges that you're facing in delivering pump storage.
Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of Doug's comments there. We'd see that the mechanisms at the moment probably are not right, and they've sort of evolved over time, and they're probably not fit for purpose for what we're doing now. So we've talked a lot about the issues that we face with high penetration levels of wind in Scotland in particular, and what that does. And as Doug mentioned, the market probably won't do it to the extent that you need to, because naturally, as you get more and more wind, the price goes down. So those windy periods, and it becomes more and more of a problem for people to invest. So we think our principal concerns are really just finding some mechanism to support all of these system enablers, such as pump storage, or any other sorts of storage mechanisms, because not only do they get market revenues from power, they also provide other services. So I think that Alan mentioned things like Black Start. We also provide flexibility services, so we keep the system balanced by providing inertia. It provides reactive power in the area to help give the power the oomph it needs to get down to England from the Scottish generation areas. So I think what we'd see is we need something. We've talked about potentially a ring-fenced capacity mechanism for long duration storage, long duration, long build time storage, or even renewable projects. That may or may not work in terms of how that fits with other technologies that sit in that category. I think we've seen in the past quite a lot of unintended consequences of regulatory regimes coming in place. We've seen things like the proliferation of diesel generators that happened 4 or 5 years ago under the capacity market, because it incentivized quick build distributed generation active projects, which had no intention of running, but when they did, they were very high polluting machines.
Okay, thanks, David. And just while we're on challenges, getting out of the specifics of regulation, just to speak to one of the first questions that came in about overall what are the biggest challenges for pumped hydro storage systems. Is it the time that it takes? Is it the cost of construction? Is it the guarantee of revenues down the line? I mean, we've talked around a lot of those issues, but I just wonder if you could kind of crystallize it for us.
It's a combination of the time of construction. As we said, 6 years. It doesn't fit with the current capacity market, which requires you to build within 3.5 years. And it's the duration of the asset as well. As I mentioned, these assets have probably got a life of 50 years, which is longer than anything else on the system at the moment. And for a private investor to invest in something that's 50 years duration, that takes a lot of confidence. We've even seen that the nuclear investments that people like EDF are making, they need a guarantee for their 35-year life. We're looking at 50-year life for these projects, which is something that's quite difficult for private investors to think about on their time horizons.
Okay, thanks, David. Alan, I just wonder, given the kind of time horizons that we're talking about, and given that you are kind of very publicly an advocate for government support for these projects, do you find it a challenging conversation to have with government, given that you're talking about kind of releasing support for such a long-term project, i.e. they're not going to see and be able to, I guess, get political wins from the benefits that these projects are going to provide over the long term? Is it hard to make the case for, consistent and sufficient government support?
To be honest, Tom, I've not had that conversation where I've not felt that they can't see the benefits, or that it's too long duration. I mean, if I go back to my other hobby horse of nuclear, obviously quite happy to look at another new nuclear power station, which, that's at least 10 years construction. So it's the same kind of political argument. You might not see the benefits, in your term in Parliament. So I don't think that's been an issue. But equally, I think, conversely, when I contradict myself, I think part of the problem is, though, they're not committing to enough long-term planning. So that in itself therefore becomes an issue. By not doing that long-term planning, what net zero actually looks like in 2050, that in itself becomes a barrier, because you're not taking that long-term strategic approach. And so just jumping back to regulation, so Doug touched on principle for storage in general. There's an issue that you can get double charged because of the way the Electricity Act defines generation. So the UK government committed to actually amend the Electricity Act to define electricity storage as a distinct subset of generation. of generation. They've been committing to this for a few years now. I keep following up on parliamentary questions, and the answer always comes back, we'll do it when parliamentary time allows. Well, it's a simple secondary legislation process to amend that Electricity Act. So if you're serious about long-term planning and actually helping kickstart the market and storage in general, why don't you do that simple thing? And that's really, that's what I find really frustrating. It's that lack of coherent, joined up thinking, and it's just, say that becomes an inability to actually set the market for the future.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to start to wrap this up, because Alan, I know you've got a select committee session to get off to. I think first of all, David, there's a specific question here which is best tackled by you about any steps that have been taken to start engagement with the energy networks, given how complex the required upgrades to the network in the area will be, and whether this has been a consideration in looking at the target connection date.
Yes, this is one of the things that we've started engaging with both Scottish Power Transmission and Scottish Hydro Transmission, because it connects indirectly to both of those networks there, and we're aware of some of the constraints in the area, and this is one of the problems that everybody faces with connections in Scotland. And I think everybody has recognised the fact that a lot of investment needs to go into the Scottish energy network in order to allow a lot of renewables to come on. So we're seeing wind farms being unable to connect just because there's not export capacity in the area.
Okay, thanks, David. And I think, Doug, I'm going to ask you this one first, but I'm going to ask David and Alan if you want to come in as well. It's from Keith McLean, who is a fan of hydro and pump storage, but he says that he worries that we are only scratching the surface of what needs to be done to replace natural gas as the means of balancing the electricity and heat sectors. And some stats: so to replace daily gas storage, we would need about 500 Cruachans. To replace seasonal gas capacity, we'd need about 10,000. And to replace inter-year balancing capability, it would be about 20,000. How are we going to do this? A very simple question, which I imagine is going to lead to quite a complicated answer. So, Doug, I can't think of anybody more capable of kicking that off than you.
Yes,
and then I think David, then we'll get some closing remarks from Alan, and we'll wrap it up there, I think.
Yes, thanks, and hello, Keith. Thank you for that. Well, what I would say is Cruachan going to be enough? Now, clearly, it's not going to be anywhere like enough. Now, I tried to do some back of a fag package calculations to see how much what we need to do to get a fully renewable system, and basically gave up because it gets quite complicated quite quickly in terms of weather systems and so on. So I guess I have to just rely on those people who've got those integrated models that say how much storage do you actually need to make it work. Now, as I said in my introductory remarks, there have been a couple that have come out recently. One is from Energy Systems Catapult for Good Energy, and one is from Imperial. Both of those use either hour by hour or half hour by half hour analysis of weather patterns with a level of deployment that reaches net zero. And as Alan referred to, one was a 98% variable renewables system. That was the SC analysis. Now, both of those interestingly come up with the same sort of amount of storage. I mean, not in detail, but they both come up with sort of 100 gigawatts of storage. Now, that's an awful lot. They see most of that being in batteries, but again, as Alan said, you can clip off a good chunk of that storage if you've got long duration storage. And with already there being concerns about kind of lithium mining and so on, then I think if we can use things other than batteries where we know they're going to work and are going to do the job, then I think we should. So that would clip the the amount of battery storage by, I'm trying to remember the diagrams now, but it was something like 8 gigawatts of batteries by having a bit more long duration storage. So those are the sort of numbers I'm thinking are now going to be needed, and that's not just Cruachan, of course. I think that was 2.5 gigawatts from memory, but don't quote me because I need to go back to the report and just check exactly how much would be required to get those kind of results.
Thanks, Doug. And David, can I throw that one over to you before bringing Alan in?
Yeah, and I think we'd agree there is no silver bullet for this, and it makes your brain hurt when you try and think about how to manage a variable system to deal with what may be a 1 in 5 year event when you get to the blocking low over the North Sea that stops wind for 2 weeks. And that may be where you start to think, do you have to be pragmatic about this and look at some negative emissions technology to actually offset a very, very short-term fix or solution? Or maybe as a society, we have to recognise the fact that demand-side reduction will have to play a bigger part in this, and that there may be times when some industries have to shut down or customers have to curtail because there is no wind.
Thanks, David. Alan, I'm just going to ask if you've got any closing remarks before we wrap the meeting up and give everybody a couple of minutes back before I'm sure they've got more engagements at 11 o'clock.
I suppose just to say what David says, I mean, pumped storage hydro in itself is not a silver bullet, but it certainly is very important. It's a proven technology, and considering like the offshore wind generation target we got set for 2030, it just makes sense if you're actually deploying, plan to deploy such high levels of intermittent renewables. Well, we know the long-term storage duration works, so let's go on with it.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I want to thank David and Doug and Alan for spending the time with us today. David, we'll get your presentation round as a kind of definitive explainer for the site and for the expansion to everybody who's been on the call and then to our wider network. There's been a few reports mentioned, and we'll make sure that the links are sent out to everybody who's joined as well by way of follow-up. I want to thank Jinni Minto for joining as well and for jumping in to offer her perspective. I'm sorry that Ben wasn't able to join us. I've been resisting the temptation for any Alan Partridge fans on this call to describe Roger Moore as at Chiswick Roundabout for the entire time, and I've just not been quite able to manage it. But I'm sorry he wasn't able to join us. I hope it didn't affect the event too much. We'll be in touch with some follow-up. PRASEG's got a load of stuff coming up in the next few weeks. On the domestic side, we're going to be looking at consumer confidence in green tariffs and how that relates to net zero. We've got another progress report briefing with Lord Deben. And then on the international side, we've got a focus on China, we've got a focus on the United States, we've got a focus on the least developed countries, and on kind of fossil fuel heavy economies, all in the context of COP26. And we're going to be looking back at the NATO summit where a big security and climate change action plan was signed by heads of government. All that stuff's going to be on the website by the end of the day. I'll link to it when we follow up in the next couple of days from this meeting. But thanks again to all our panelists. Thanks to everybody who's joined, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.